In the gleaming boardroom of Zenith Technologies, a 64-year-old Korean-American engineer was about to face the most devastating betrayal of her 4-decade career. What started as a routine quarterly review took a shocking turn when she came face-to-face with corporate conspiracy, guided by cosmic delusion. Mika Bradley wasn't your typical Silicon Valley employee. She was the brilliant architect behind 47 revolutionary quantum computing patents worth billions. When she encountered her CEO's psychic advisor orchestrating her termination to install an unqualified philosophy graduate, she had no idea she was walking into a battle that would reshape global patent law forever. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The elevator's polished steel doors reflected Mika Bradley's face back at her in fragments. Sharp cheekbones, silver-streaked hair pulled into its usual neat bun, dark eyes that had seen 4 decades of Silicon Valley's evolution. At 64, she still felt the same thrill riding up to the 42nd floor of Zenith Technologies that she'd experienced as a young immigrant engineer, clutching her first patent application with trembling hands. Today's quarterly review should have been routine, another checkbox in her methodical approach to corporate life. But the moment the elevator opened, Mika sensed something amiss. Richard Sterling's executive assistant, usually warm and chatty, barely met her eye. The familiar hum of the quantum computing lab seemed muted through the glass walls, and the usual cluster of engineers around her workstation was conspicuously absent. "Miss Bradley, they're waiting for you in conference room A," the assistant said, her voice strained with artificial brightness. Mika's engineering mind immediately parsed the plural. Quarterly reviews were one-on-one affairs. She'd conducted enough of them herself before her promotion to chief patent engineer. Her sensible heels clicked against the marble floor as she walked past the wall of framed patents, 17 of them bearing her name prominently, each one representing months or years of meticulous research and development. Conference Room A was Zenith's cathedral of corporate power, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the South Bay and a table that could seat 20. Today, only 3 chairs were occupied. Richard Sterling sat at the head, his usually immaculate appearance slightly disheveled, his designer tie askew. To his right sat a woman Mika recognized but had never been formally introduced to: Crystal Morrison, Sterling's so-called strategic advisor, whose influence over the CEO had become increasingly apparent in recent months. And beside her, a young man who looked uncomfortable in his ill-fitting suit, fidgeting with a coffee cup that bore the Zenith logo. "Mika, please, sit down," Sterling said, gesturing to the chair across from him. His voice carried an unfamiliar tension, and he avoided her direct gaze. In the 10 years since he'd inherited the company from his father, Mika had watched Sterling evolve from an eager but insecure heir into a competent leader. This version of him, nervous, almost apologetic, was entirely new. Crystal Morrison leaned forward slightly, her jewelry catching the afternoon light streaming through the windows. She was perhaps 55, with platinum blonde hair and the kind of intense stare that made Mika think of carnival fortune teller, which, according to office gossip, wasn't far from the truth. "Mika," Sterling began, then stopped, glancing at Crystal Morrison as if seeking permission to continue. The pause stretched uncomfortably. "I want to start by saying how much we've valued your contributions to Zenith over the year. Your work on the quantum coherence patents has been exceptional." The past tense hit Mika like ice water. In her 4 decades in tech, she'd sat through enough corporate conversations to recognize the compliments, the careful phrasing, the way Sterling's hands trembled slightly as he reached for his water glass, all signs pointing to one inevitable conclusion. However, Sterling continued, and there it was, the conjunction that preceded every corporate execution. "We've been doing a strategic realignment of our engineering division. The board and I have decided that it's time for a generational transition in leadership." Crystal Morrison's lips curved into what might have been a smile. "The universe has been very clear about the need for fresh energy in this department," she said, her voice carrying the practiced cadence of someone accustomed to making pronouncements. "Young minds, unburdened by old paradigms." Mika's analytical mind cataloged every detail. The way Sterling winced at Crystal's words, the uncomfortable silence that followed, the way the young man, who had to be Danny Morrison, Crystal's son, seemed to be studying his hands with intense fascination. "I'm being fired," Mika said quietly, her voice steady despite the earthquake occurring beneath her carefully composed exterior. "Restructured," Sterling corrected quickly. "We're offering a very generous severance package. And I'd like you to meet Danny Morrison," Crystal interrupted, placing a possessive hand on her son's shoulder. "He'll be taking over your responsibility. Danny has a degree in philosophy from Berkeley and brings a fresh perspective to quantum computing." Danny Morrison finally looked up, his face flushed with embarrassment. "Ms. Bradley, I just want to say that I know I have big shoes to fill. Your work is legendary around here." The sincerity in his voice almost made it worse. This wasn't malicious, it was incompetence masquerading as corporate strategy, guided by a woman who claimed to channel the universe's business advice. "Philosophy," Mika repeated, her voice carefully neutral. "That's certainly an interesting background for quantum patent engineering." Sterling shifted uncomfortably. "Danny's been studying our patents extensively. Crystal has assured me that his unconventional approach will bring new insights to the field." For 40 years, Mika had navigated corporate politics with diplomatic precision. She'd smiled through countless meetings where her contributions were minimized, where younger male colleagues received credit for her innovations, where her accent was mocked behind closed doors. She'd persevered because she believed in the work, in the elegant beauty of quantum mechanics, translated into practical applications that could change the world. But this was different. This wasn't just professional disrespect. It was a fundamental negation of everything she'd built. "I see," Mika said, standing slowly. Her movements were deliberate, controlled, the same precision she brought to her laboratory work. "And when does this transition take effect?" "Immediately," Crystal Morrison said, with obvious satisfaction. "Security will escort you to collect your personal items. Your access cards have already been deactivated." The finality of it hit Mika then, not just the job loss, but the casual cruelty of 40 years of dedication erased in a conference room meeting, her life's work handed over to someone whose primary qualification was having the right mother. Sterling at least had the grace to look ashamed. "Mika, I want you to know this isn't personal, it's just business. The company needs to evolve, and sometimes that means making difficult decisions." "Of course," Mika said, gathering her purse and the portfolio she'd brought for what she'd thought would be a routine review. "Just business." As she walked toward the door, Danny Morrison spoke up again. "Bradley, I really hope you'll consider staying on as a consultant. I could really use your guidance." Mika paused, her hand on the door handle. She turned back to face the room, Sterling with his guilty expression, Crystal Morrison with her triumphant smile, and Danny Morrison with his desperate hope that somehow this could be made less awful through good intentions. "Mr. Reperson," she said, her voice carrying 4 decades of hard-earned authority, "I don't think that will be necessary. I'm sure the universe will guide you just fine." The sarcasm was so subtle that Crystal Morrison actually nodded approvingly, missing the pointed barb entirely. Security was waiting outside the conference room. 2 guards, Mika recognized from the lobby, both avoiding eye contact as they flanked her walk to her office. The ritual of packing 40 years into a cardboard box was surreal. Her diplomas, family photos, the small jade plant her late husband had given her when she received her first patent. Her computer access was already dead, her files locked away in servers she'd helped design. The walk to the parking garage felt endless, every colleague who saw her small procession understanding immediately what was happening. Some offered sympathetic nods, others busied themselves with their phones, afraid that termination might be contagious. Sitting in her Prius in the underground garage, Mika finally allowed herself to feel the full weight of what had just occurred. Her hands shook as she gripped the steering wheel, and for a moment, the tears she'd held back threatened to overwhelm her composure. But as the initial shock receded, something else began to take its place. Mika's mind, trained by decades of complex problem-solving, began to work. Sterling's decision wasn't just morally questionable, it might be legally questionable as well. And if there was one thing Mika understood better than quantum mechanics, it was the intricate web of patent law that governed her industry. She pulled out her phone and scrolled through her contacts until she found David Chen's number. If anyone would know the legal implications of what had just happened, it would be him. As she waited for David to answer, Mika stared up at the Zenith building rising above her, its glass surface reflecting the California sun. 40 years of her life lived within those walls, 40 years of innovation and dedication dismissed in a 15-minute meeting. But dismissal, she was beginning to realize, was not the same as defeat. And Richard Sterling, guided by his crystal ball consultant, might have just made the most expensive mistake in corporate history. The phone rang once, twice, then David's familiar voice came through the speaker. "Mika, this is a nice surprise. What can I do for you?" "David," Mika said, her voice steady and determined, "I need to talk to you about patent law, specifically about what happens when an essential patent holder is terminated without proper cause." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "That's a very specific question. Are we talking hypothetically?" Mika started her car and pulled out of the parking garage, leaving Zenith Technologies in her rearview mirror. For the first time in hours she smiled. "Not hypothetically, David. Not hypothetically at all." Mika's home office was a testament to 4 decades of meticulous documentation. Filing cabinets lined the walls like sentinels, each drawer labeled with the precision of a research laboratory. As she sat at her mahogany desk, still wearing the navy blazer she'd chosen for what she'd believed would be a routine quarterly review, the cardboard box from Zenith seemed almost pathetic beside the archives of her career. The jade plant from her husband looked wilted under the afternoon sun streaming through her window. Even it seemed to understand that everything had changed. Not hypothetically at all, she'd told David Chen an hour ago, and now she was about to discover just how literally true that statement might be. Mika pulled out the thick manila folder, labeled Employment Contract, Zenith Technologies 2014, and spread its contents across her desk. The legal language that had seemed routine 10 years ago now demanded her complete attention. Page by page, she worked through the dense text, her engineering mind parsing each clause with the same precision she'd once applied to quantum equations. Her phone buzzed with a text from her son James. "Mom, heard through the grapevine something happened at Zenith. Call me." The tech industry grapevine was faster than fiber optic cables. She'd been terminated 3 hours ago, and word was already spreading. But James would have to wait. Right now she had more pressing concerns than managing her family's worry. It was on page 47 of her employment contract that Mika found the first piece of the puzzle, a clause she'd barely noticed when she'd signed it, buried in subsection 4 under intellectual property maintenance responsibilities. The language was dry, almost impossibly technical, but to someone with Mika's background it might as well have been written in neon light. Employee acknowledges classification as essential patent holder under International Patent Cooperation Treaty, Article 47 for all patents where employee is primary inventor and technical maintenance specialist. Mika's heart began to race. She reached for her second filing cabinet and pulled out a folder she hadn't touched in years, her collection of international patent law references. The International Patent Cooperation Treaty was dense, arcane material that most engineers never bothered to understand. But Mika had always been thorough. Article 47 was even more technical than her employment contract, but as she read, the implications became staggeringly clear. An essential patent holder wasn't just a title, it was a legal designation that made certain individuals irreplaceable for maintaining active international patents. The termination of an essential patent holder without following specific protocols could trigger automatic patent freeze provision. She grabbed her laptop and pulled up the patent database, logging in with credentials she'd maintained independently for research purposes. 47 patents. She was primary inventor on 47 quantum computing patents currently generating licensing revenue for Zenith Technologies. Her phone rang. David Chen. "Mika, I've been thinking about your question since we hung up." David's voice carried an excitement she recognized, the tone of someone who'd stumbled onto a fascinating legal puzzle. "How many patents are we talking about?" 47, Mika said, her voice barely above a whisper. The silence on the other end stretched for nearly 30 seconds. "Jesus, Mika, 47, and you were terminated today without any notice to the International Patent Cooperation Office?" "That's correct. Do you have your employment contract handy?" "I'm looking at it right now." Page 47. Subsection 2. She could hear David typing furiously. I'm pulling up the treaty language now. Mika, if what I think is happening is actually happening, then Sterling didn't just fire you. He may have inadvertently triggered the biggest patent crisis in tech industry history. Mika's doorbell rang. Through her window she could see her son James standing on her front porch, his face creased with concern. He must have driven straight from his financial advisory office in downtown San Jose. David, I need to call you back, but first, what's the potential scope of this? If I'm reading this correctly, and if you truly qualify as an essential patent holder for quantum computing patents that are currently generating international licensing revenue, we could be looking at a complete freeze of quantum computing licenses worldwide until this is resolved. The licensing revenue alone could be in the billions. How long would such a freeze last? Until the essential patent holder is either properly reinstated with full acknowledgement of the violation, or until new essential patent holders are designated through a process that typically takes 18 to 24 months. The doorbell rang again, more insistently this time. I have to go, Mika said. But David, I need you to research the exact filing requirements for triggering this freeze, and I need to know by tomorrow morning. Mika, are you seriously considering? I'm considering my legal options, she said firmly. All of that. She opened the front door to find James pacing on her porch, his usually perfectly styled hair disheveled from running his hands through it, a nervous habit he'd inherited from his father. Mom, what the hell happened today? James stepped into her foyer, his eyes immediately scanning her face for signs of distress. Sarah Kim called me, she said. Security walked you out of the building. I was terminated, Mika said simply, leading him into her home office. Richard Sterling decided he needed fresh blood in the engineering department. James stopped short when he saw her desk: employment contracts, patent documentation and legal references spread across every available surface. Mom, what is all this? Research, Mika said, settling back into her chair. It appears that my termination may have been more legally complicated than Sterling realized. James picked up one of the patent documents, his financial background allowing him to understand at least the licensing revenue figure. His eyes widened. These patents generate how much in annual licensing fees? Collectively, just over $400 million per year, and they fired you. James set the document down carefully as if it might explode. Mom, these people aren't just stupid, they're catastrophically incompetent. For the first time since sitting in that conference room, Mika felt a genuine smile cross her face. That's precisely what I'm beginning to realize. Her laptop chimed with an email notification. David Chen had sent her a preliminary legal brief, 10 pages of dense analysis that made her heart race with possibility. James, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me. Her son sat down across from her, his expression serious. Of course, if I told you that I might have legal grounds to freeze every quantum computing patent license worldwide until this termination is properly addressed, what would you say? James was quiet for a long moment, his financial mind clearly working through the implication. I'd say that's either the most brilliant legal strategy in corporate history, or it's a very dangerous game that could destroy your reputation forever. And if I told you that the potential economic impact could reach into the billions of dollars, then I'd say Richard Sterling picked the wrong engineer to fire. Mika looked at her son, her cautious, practical son, who'd spent his entire adult life advising people to take safe, measured approaches to financial decisions. If James was even cautiously supportive of this path, then perhaps she wasn't being reckless. Her phone buzzed with another text. This one from Elena Vasquez, her former colleague. Mika, I can't believe what happened today. If you need anything, documents, testimony, anything, please let me know. What they did was wrong. 40 years in Silicon Valley had taught Mika that success often came to those who saw opportunities that others missed. As she looked at the legal documentation spread across her desk, she realized that Richard Sterling, guided by his psychic advisor, had just handed her the opportunity of a lifetime. James, she said, reaching for her phone to call Sarah Collins, the employment attorney whose card she'd kept in her desk drawer for years. I think it's time your mother stopped playing by their rules. The sun was setting over Silicon Valley, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Tomorrow, Mika decided, she would begin to change the rules entirely. The morning fog was just beginning to lift from the hills as Mika sat in the parking lot outside Sarah Collins' law office, gathering her courage. She'd spent the night reading David Chen's legal brief 3 times, each pass revealing new layers of complexity and opportunity. The manila folder on her passenger seat contained 40 years of meticulous documentation, employment records, patent filings, performance reviews, and most importantly, the employment contract that might just bring down Richard Sterling's empire. Sarah Collins' office occupied the top floor of a restored Victorian in downtown Palo Alto, a deliberate choice that projected both respectability and independence. Mika climbed the narrow stairs, her heels echoing in the quiet morning air, carrying the weight of a decision that could change everything. Ms. Bradley, Sarah Collins stood as Mika entered her office, extending a firm handshake. At 42, Sarah had the sharp, focused energy of someone who'd fought for every success. Her office walls displayed her law degree from Stanford, several employment law awards, and a photo of her shaking hands with the governor after winning a landmark discrimination case. I have to admit, your call yesterday intrigued me. Age discrimination cases are my specialty, but you mentioned patent complications. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Mika settled into the leather chair across from Sarah's desk, placing her folder between them like a declaration of war. Ms. Collins, I believe what happened to me yesterday goes far beyond simple age discrimination. I think Zenith Technologies may have committed one of the most expensive legal errors in corporate history. Sarah's eyebrows rose slightly. That's a bold statement. Tell me what happened. For the next 30 minutes, Mika methodically laid out the events of her termination, watching Sarah's expression shift from professional interest to genuine astonishment as the implications became clear. Let me make sure I understand this correctly, Sarah said, leaning forward in her chair. You're classified as an essential patent holder under international treaty for 47 quantum computing patents, generating over $400 million in annual licensing revenue, and Sterling terminated you without following proper notification protocols. That's correct. And according to my research with David Chen, you know David, the patent law specialist, this termination may trigger an automatic freeze of all related international licensing agreements. Sarah was quiet for a moment, her legal mind clearly working through the possibility. Mika, if what you're suggesting is accurate, we're not just talking about a wrongful termination suit. We're talking about leverage that could force one of the largest settlements in employment law history. Or, Mika said quietly, we could use that leverage to create real change. New policies to protect older workers, transparency requirements for hiring decisions, accountability measures for executives who make personnel decisions based on. She paused, remembering Crystal Morrison's intense stare. Unconventional advice. Meanwhile, across Silicon Valley, Marcus Webb was having the worst morning of his 20-year legal career. Zenith's general counsel had arrived at the office at 6 a.m., hoping to clear his desk before the Monday morning chaos began. Instead, he'd found an urgent email from the International Patent Cooperation Office that made his blood run cold. Notice of potential patent maintenance violation, essential patent holder status inquiry, urgent response required. Marcus had been Sterling's legal advisor long enough to know when the company was in real trouble, and this had all the markings of a catastrophic legal crisis. He'd spent the last 2 hours reviewing Mika Bradley's employment file, cross-referencing it with international patent law, and discovering that Zenith had just walked into a legal minefield. His phone rang. Sterling's assistant. Mr. Webb? Mr. Sterling needs to see you immediately. He's in conference room A with Ms. Morrison. Marcus gathered the patent documents and headed upstairs, his stomach sinking with each step. Sterling and Crystal Morrison were already seated when he arrived, their body language suggesting they'd been arguing. Marcus, thank God. Sterling looked haggard, his usual confidence replaced by barely controlled panic. Tell me you have good news about this Bradley situation. Marcus set the stack of documents on the table with a heavy thud. Richard, we have a problem, a very serious problem. Crystal Morrison waved dismissively. The universe has shown me that this woman is trying to manipulate negative energy into positive outcomes. It won't work. The cosmos doesn't reward vindictive behavior. The cosmos, Marcus said flatly, doesn't have jurisdiction over international patent law, but the World Intellectual Property Organization does, and they've just sent us a formal inquiry about our termination of an essential patent holder. Sterling's face went pale. What does that mean? It means, Marcus continued, pulling out David Chen's preliminary analysis that had somehow made its way to his desk through legal channels, that Mika Bradley wasn't just an employee, she was legally designated as irreplaceable for maintaining our quantum computing patent. Her termination without proper notification may have triggered an automatic freeze of all licensing agreements. The silence in the room was deafening. How much money are we talking about? Sterling asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Marcus consulted his notes. Our quantum computing patents generate approximately $400 million in annual licensing revenue. If those licenses are frozen pending resolution of this dispute, and if other companies' related patents are also affected, he paused, doing mental calculation. The total global impact could reach $1.8 billion. Crystal Morrison stood abruptly. This is impossible. The energy patterns I saw clearly indicated that removing the old paradigm would create space for new growth. The cards never lie. The cards, Marcus said, his professional composure finally cracking, don't understand federal employment law or international patent treaties. Richard, I need to know exactly what advice Morrison gave you about terminating Mika Bradley, because if this decision was based on anything other than legitimate business reasons, we're looking at potential fraud charges in addition to the patent violations. Sterling's hands were shaking now. Crystal said the universe was sending clear signals that Mika's energy was blocking Danny's potential. She said the stars were aligned for generational transition. Marcus closed his eyes, imagining the headlines that would destroy not just Sterling but the entire company. Richard, you terminated one of the most legally protected employees in corporate America, because a psychic told you the stars said so. Back in Sarah Collins' office, Mika was reviewing the legal strategy they'd developed. Two parallel tracks, a traditional wrongful termination suit focusing on age discrimination, and the nuclear option filing formal notification with international patent authorities that could freeze licensing agreements worldwide. The beauty of this approach, Sarah explained, is that we don't have to choose immediately. We file the wrongful termination suit first, which gives us legal standing and discovery rights. Meanwhile, we prepare the patent freeze notification as leverage. And if they refuse to settle reasonably, Sarah smiled, and Mika saw in that expression the same fierce determination that had built her own career. Then we show Richard Sterling and his psychic advisor exactly how expensive their cosmic guidance really is. Mika's phone buzzed with a text from Elena Vasquez. Heard Sterling called an emergency board meeting. Whatever you're planning, you've got their attention. Through the office window, Mika could see the Zenith building rising in the distance, its glass surface catching the morning sun. Somewhere in that building, Sterling was probably realizing that firing her had been the worst business decision of his life. Sarah, Mika said, gathering her documents, let's file both suits. It's time to teach Silicon Valley that experience isn't a liability. It's a weapon. The war was about to begin, and Mika Bradley intended to win it. The notification went out at exactly 9:00 a.m. Pacific time on a Tuesday that would be remembered as the day Silicon Valley held its breath. Mika had signed the patent freeze documents in Sarah Collins' office, her signature on the international filing as precise and deliberate as every patent application she'd ever submitted. Within hours, the automated systems of the World Intellectual Property Organization began processing what would become the largest patent freeze in technological history. At Quantum Dynamics in Austin, Texas, Chief Technology Officer Michael Harrison was reviewing their quarterly budget when his phone rang with news that would cost his company $200 million in frozen projects. At Advanced Computing Solutions in Tokyo, an entire research division was suddenly told to halt all quantum computing development. In London, Berlin, and Toronto, engineers received identical messages. All licensing agreements for quantum computing patents related to Bradley Zenith Technologies were immediately suspended pending legal resolution. Jennifer Stone was having her morning coffee at her desk at Tech Reporter when the first story broke on a competing tech blog. As a business journalist who'd been tracking Silicon Valley corruption for 3 years, she immediately recognized this as more than just another corporate loss. The scale was unprecedented. A single terminated employee had apparently brought the global quantum computing industry to its knees. One 64-year-old engineer versus the entire tech industry, she murmured to herself, already reaching for her phone to start making calls. This was the kind of David versus Goliath story that could define a career. Her first call was to David Chen, whose name appeared in the initial court filings as Mika Bradley's patent law consultant. "Mr. Chen, this is Jennifer Stone from Tech Report. I'm calling about the Bradley patent freeze situation. Can you confirm that licensing agreements worth over $1 billion have been suspended?" David's voice carried barely contained excitement. "Miss Stone, what we're seeing here is unprecedented. When an essential patent holder is terminated without proper international notification, it triggers automatic protective measures. The system is designed to prevent corporate entities from circumventing patent law by simply firing the people who hold the technical knowledge. And you're saying Zenith Technologies didn't follow proper procedures? From what I can determine based on public filings, they treated this as a standard employment termination rather than the complex international legal matter it actually was. It's like demolishing a building without checking if it's load-bearing for the entire neighborhood." Meanwhile, in conference rooms across Silicon Valley, emergency meetings were erupting as the scope of the crisis became clear. At tech giant Corp, whose quantum encryption project relied heavily on Bradley's patents, CEO Amanda Walsh was screaming at her legal team, "How did none of you know about essential patent holder requirements? We're talking about a $2 billion project that's now frozen because some psychic told Richard Sterling to fire his best engineer." The stock market reacted with predictable panic. Zenith Technologies' stock price plummeted 30% in the first hour of trading. Companies with significant quantum computing investments saw their shares drop in sympathy. By noon, nearly $50 billion in market capitalization had evaporated. At Zenith's headquarters, Richard Sterling stood at his office window watching protesters gather in the parking lot. Word had leaked about Crystal Morrison's role in Mika's termination, and the signs reflected the public's incredulity. "Fortune tellers don't make good CEOs and fire the psychic, hire back the engineer." Sterling's phone hadn't stopped ringing. Board members, investors, industry leaders, all demanding explanations he couldn't provide without admitting that he'd made a multi-billion-dollar decision based on crystal ball readings. Crystal Morrison sat across from his desk, her usual serene confidence replaced by defensive anger. "Richard, you have to trust the process. The universe is testing our resolve. This woman is channeling dark energy, trying to disrupt the cosmic balance we've worked so hard to achieve." "Crystal," Sterling said, his voice strained, "our stock is in free fall. Companies around the world are threatening to sue us for damages. The board is calling an emergency meeting tomorrow to discuss my removal as CEO. I need solutions, not spiritual guidance." Danny Morrison knocked hesitantly on the office door. In the 3 days since his unexpected promotion, he'd been desperately trying to understand the quantum computing patents he was supposedly qualified to manage. The futility of the task had become crushingly apparent. "Mr. Sterling, I think I need to talk to you about something." "Not now, Danny," Crystal snapped. "Can't you see we're dealing with a crisis?" "Mom, that's exactly what I need to talk about." Danny's voice carried a firmness that surprised everyone in the room. "I've been trying to review Ms. Bradley's work and I can't do this job. I don't understand quantum mechanics. I barely understand the legal language in these patent applications. Hiring me was a mistake." Sterling and Crystal stared at him in stunned silence. "You're just overwhelmed," Crystal said quickly. "The negative energy from that woman is affecting your confidence. We need to do a cleansing ritual." "Mom, stop." Danny's voice was quiet but resolute. "This isn't about energy or cosmic forces. This is about the fact that I'm not qualified for this position, and everyone knows it. Bradley spent 40 years becoming an expert in quantum computing. I spent 4 years studying philosophy. This isn't going to work." Jennifer Stone's investigation was revealing layers of corporate dysfunction, that went far beyond a single wrongful termination. Her interviews with current and former Zenith employees painted a picture of a CEO increasingly dependent on mystical guidance for business decisions. Elena Vasquez had agreed to meet with Jennifer at a coffee shop in downtown Palo Alto, nervous but determined to tell her story. "It started about 3 years ago," Elena explained, glancing around to make sure they weren't being overheard. "Sterling's divorce was finalized, and he seemed lost. That's when Crystal Morrison showed up as a strategic consultant. At first it was just occasional meetings, but gradually, she started having input on major decisions." "Can you give me specific examples?" Elena pulled out her phone, scrolling through what appeared to be carefully documented notes. "Last year, Sterling delayed a major product launch by 6 months because Crystal said Mercury was in retrograde. He restructured the entire marketing department based on her reading of the team's astrological compatibility. And 2 months ago, he killed a partnership with Samsung because Crystal said their corporate energy signature was incompatible with Zenith's mission. And you documented all of this." "I started keeping records when I realized how serious it was getting. I never thought it would lead to something like this. But," Elena gestured toward the news playing on the coffee shop's television, showing footage of the growing protests outside Zenith's headquarters. Back at Mika's house, James Bradley was pacing in his mother's living room, his financial advisor's mind reeling from the day's developments. "Mom, do you understand what you've done? The entire global quantum computing industry is frozen. Stock markets are in chaos. Companies are threatening lawsuits that could last for years." Mika sat calmly at her kitchen table, reading news coverage of the patent freeze on her laptop. "I triggered a legal mechanism that was specifically designed to prevent exactly what Richard Sterling did to me. The chaos you're describing isn't my fault, it's the consequence of Sterling's illegal action. But the scale of this," James shook his head, "you've essentially held the entire industry hostage." "No," Mika said quietly, closing her laptop and looking directly at her son. "I've demonstrated that actions have consequences. Even for CEOs who think they can make multi-billion-dollar decisions based on psychic advice. Especially for them." Her phone rang. Sarah Collins. "Mika, I just got off a call with Marcus Webb. Zenith wants to talk settlement." "Already, it's only been 12 hours since the freeze took effect. 12 hours during which their stock price has crashed, and they've been named in the first of what will probably be dozens of lawsuits from companies affected by the patent freeze. Richard Sterling is learning a very expensive lesson about the importance of following proper legal procedures." Mika looked out her window at the Silicon Valley skyline, where the Zenith building stood like a monument to corporate arrogance. Tomorrow she would find out exactly how much Sterling was willing to pay for his cosmic guidance. "Schedule the meeting," she said. "But make it clear that this isn't just about money, this is about accountability." The war had begun, and Mika Bradley was winning. Jennifer Stone's exposé went live at 6 a.m. Pacific time, and by 8 a.m. it had been shared over 50,000 times. "The Psychic CEO, How Fortune-Telling Froze the Global Tech Industry" became the most read article in Tech Reporter's history, its headline perfectly capturing the surreal nature of Silicon Valley's latest crisis. The article was devastating in its precision. Jennifer had spent 3 sleepless days verifying every detail, cross-referencing Elena Vasquez's documentation with public records and anonymous sources throughout Zenith Technologies. The story she painted was of a brilliant engineer systematically destroyed by a CEO who had abdicated rational decision-making to a carnival fortune-teller turned corporate consultant. According to internal documents obtained by Tech Reporter, Jennifer had written, Crystal Morrison advised CEO Richard Sterling on personnel decisions using tarot cards, astrological charts, and what she described as cosmic energy reading. The termination of Mika Bradley, a 64-year-old Korean-American engineer who held 47 critical quantum computing patents, was reportedly decided during a session where Morrison claimed the universe was demanding generational transition. By noon, every major news outlet in the world was running variations of the story. CNN, led with tech CEO's psychic advisor triggers billion-dollar industry crisis. The Wall Street Journal's headline read, When Fortune-Telling Meets Patent Law, The Zenith disaster. Even late-night comedians were already preparing monologues about the CEO who let astrology destroy his company. Mika watched the coverage from her living room, Sarah Collins beside her on the couch, both women recognizing that the battle had shifted into territory neither had fully anticipated. This was no longer just about employment law or patent violations. It had become a cultural phenomenon. "We need to get ahead of this," Sarah said, scrolling through the flood of media requests on her phone. "Every news organization in the country wants to interview you. This is your chance to control the narrative." Mika's phone buzzed with a text from James. "Mom, you're trending on Twitter. Patent Justice has over 2 million posts. People are calling you a hero." At Zenith headquarters, Richard Sterling was discovering that being the subject of global ridicule was far worse than financial loss. He stood in his office watching a CNN correspondent deliver a live report from the company parking lot, where protesters had gathered with signs reading "Fire the Fortune Teller" and "Six." Crystal Morrison paced behind his desk, her usual serene demeanor replaced by frantic energy. "Richard, we need to fight back. This woman has poisoned the media against us. She's channeling dark forces through the press. Crystal, please." Sterling's voice carried exhaustion and growing desperation. "The board is meeting in 2 hours to discuss my removal. Half our major clients are threatening to terminate their contracts. Our stock has lost 40% of its value. I need actual solutions, not spiritual warfare." Marcus Webb entered without knocking, carrying a stack of legal documents that seemed to grow heavier with each passing hour. "Richard, we have a problem. Actually, we have about 20 problems, all of them lawsuits filed by companies affected by the patent freeze. The damages they're claiming total over $3 billion. How is that possible? Tech giant's quantum encryption project is stalled indefinitely. Quantum Dynamics had to lay off 200 employees. Advanced Computing Solutions is claiming their IPO has been delayed by 6 months. Every company that licensed Bradley's patents is naming us in damages suits." Marcus set the documents on Sterling's desk with a heavy thud, and that's just day one. Meanwhile, Mika was preparing for her first major television interview. Sarah had chosen 60 Minutes, recognizing that the gravitas of the program would help frame Mika as a serious professional rather than just another disgruntled employee. The interview was scheduled for the following day, but the pre-interview call with the producer had already revealed the show's approach. "Ms. Bradley," the producer had said, "we want to focus on the broader implications of your case. This isn't just about wrongful termination, it's about ageism in Silicon Valley, the concentration of power in tech, and apparently, the role of mysticism in corporate decision-making." As they prepared talking points, Sarah's phone rang constantly with media requests. "Good Morning America wants you for tomorrow's show. The Today Show is offering a prime segment. NPR wants an hour-long interview for their business program. I think we should be selective," Mika said thoughtfully. "The goal isn't maximum exposure, it's the right exposure. I want to be seen as a serious professional who was wronged, not as entertainment." At that moment, across Silicon Valley, Elena Vasquez was having the most terrifying day of her career. Her decision to come forward with evidence of Sterling's erratic behavior had made her an instant target. She'd been placed on administrative leave, pending an internal investigation, and her access to Zenith systems had been revoked. But Elena had anticipated this response. Years of working in corporate environments had taught her to protect herself, and she'd carefully copied relevant documents to her personal devices long before agreeing to speak with Jennifer Stone. Her phone rang. Jennifer Stone. "Elena, I just want to thank you again for your courage in coming forward. The response to the story has been incredible." "I'm scared," Elena admitted. "They've basically fired me without calling it termination. My career in this industry might be over." "Actually, I think you'll find the opposite is true. 3 companies have already reached out asking if you'd consider joining their teams. People respect whistleblowers who stand up to corruption, especially when they have documentation to back up their claim." Danny Morrison was having his own crisis of conscience. He'd spent the morning reading about himself online, where he was variously described as unqualified, a nepotism hire, and the philosophy major who broke the tech industry. The comments were brutal, but he had to admit, largely accurate. He knocked on Sterling's office door, finding the CEO staring out his window at the growing crowd of protesters. "Mr. Sterling, I need to resign." Sterling turned, his face a mixture of surprise and resignation. "Danny, this isn't your fault. The media is looking for scapegoats." "No, sir, this is exactly my fault. Not legally, maybe, but morally. I knew I wasn't qualified for this position. I knew Miss Bradley was being treated unfairly. I should have spoken up." Crystal Morrison stood abruptly. "Daniel, you're being influenced by negative energy. This is exactly what she wants, to divide us, to make us doubt ourselves." "Mom, stop." Danny's voice was firm. "Miss Bradley didn't make me unqualified for this job. She didn't force me to accept a position I couldn't handle. That was my choice, and it was wrong." By evening, the social media phenomenon had taken on a life of its own. Patent justice was trending globally, with posts ranging from outraged support for Mika to sardonic memes about psychic business advice. Someone had created a Twitter account called Crystal CEO Advice that posted parody fortune-telling business guidance. "The stars say you should fire your most valuable employee and replace them with someone who studied philosophy. Mars is in retrograde, which means quarterly profits don't matter." Mika's story had struck a nerve that went far beyond employment law. In a tech industry infamous for ageism, her case had become a symbol of experience fighting back against youth-obsessed corporate culture. Women engineers shared their own stories of being passed over for younger, less qualified male colleagues. Older workers in all industries began using her case as an example of age discrimination. The 60 Minutes interview was scheduled for the next morning, and Mika felt ready. She'd spent 40 years in an industry that had often dismissed her contributions because of her age, her gender, and her immigrant background. Now finally the world was listening. Her phone buzzed with a text from David Chen. "Mika, I've been getting calls from patent lawyers around the world. You've essentially created a new precedent in international patent law. This case will be studied for decades." As she prepared for bed, Mika reflected on how dramatically her life had changed in just 1 week. 7 days ago, she'd been a quietly accomplished engineer approaching retirement. Now she was the center of a global media storm that was reshaping conversations about corporate accountability, workplace discrimination, and the power of knowledge over wealth. Tomorrow she would tell her story to millions of people. And Richard Sterling, guided by his psychic advisor, would learn that some battles couldn't be won with crystal balls and tarot cards. The war was far from over, but Mika Bradley was no longer fighting alone. The 60 Minutes interview had aired on Sunday night to 23 million viewers, making it the most watched episode in 2 years. Mika's calm, measured responses to correspondent Leslie Stahl's probing questions had transformed her from a tech industry footnote into a national symbol of corporate accountability. But as Monday morning arrived, the weight of global attention was beginning to take its toll. Mika sat in her kitchen staring at her untouched coffee while her phone buzzed incessantly with calls from reporters, book agents, and speaking bureaus. The woman who had spent 40 years preferring the quiet precision of engineering work was now the center of a media hurricane that showed no signs of abating. James arrived at 8 a.m., his face drawn with concern and exhaustion. He'd spent the weekend fielding calls from relatives, friends, and colleagues, all wanting to know about his suddenly famous mother. His own children had been approached by reporters at their school, forcing him to hire security for his family. "Mom, we need to talk," James said, settling into the chair across from her. "This has gone too far." Mika looked up at her son, seeing the strain in his eyes. "What do you mean?" "I mean, you're 64 years old, and you're taking on one of the most powerful companies in Silicon Valley in the most public way possible. Do you understand the stress this is putting on your health, on our family?" Before Mika could respond, her phone rang. Her cardiologist office, calling about the chest pain she'd experienced during last week's preparation for the 60 Minutes interview. She'd dismissed them as stress, but her doctor had insisted on additional tests. "Mrs. Bradley, we need you to come in this afternoon. Your EKG results show some irregularities we want to discuss." James watched his mother's face pale as she hung up the phone. "Mom, what was that about?" Nothing serious, Mika said quickly, but her voice carried uncertainty. Just routine, follow-up. Routine, follow-up for what? James's financial advisor training had taught him to recognize when people were avoiding difficult truths. Mom, have you been having health problems? The conversation was interrupted by the doorbell. Through the window, Mika could see a young man she recognized, but had never expected to see on her doorstep, Danny Morrison. Mrs. Bradley? Danny's voice carried through the door. I know this is unexpected, but I was hoping we could talk. I have something I need to say to you. James looked at his mother with alarm. You're not seriously going to let him in? But Mika was already walking toward the door. Something in Danny's voice, vulnerability perhaps, or genuine remorse, had convinced her to hear him out. Danny Morrison looked terrible. His usually neat appearance was disheveled, his eyes red-rimmed from lack of sleep. He stood on her porch holding a manila folder, his hands shaking slightly. Mrs. Bradley, I need to apologize, and I need to give you something. Danny, you don't need to. Yes, his voice was firm despite his obvious nervousness. I've been watching the news coverage, reading about what this has done to your life, to your family. I know my mom's advice led to your termination, and I know my acceptance of that job made it possible. James stood protectively near his mother. If this is some kind of corporate damage control, it's not, Danny interrupted. I resigned yesterday, officially, and I've been documenting everything I observed during my brief time at Zenith. He held out the folder. Meeting notes, recorded conversations, emails between my mother and Sterling, everything that might help your case. Meanwhile, across town, Richard Sterling was facing his own family crisis. His ex-wife Rebecca had arrived at his office unannounced, accompanied by their 2 teenage children who hadn't spoken to him in months. Richard, we need to talk, Rebecca said, her voice carrying the authority that had made her a successful attorney before their divorce. The kids are being harassed at school because of this mess you've created. Sterling's 15-year-old daughter Emma spoke up. Dad, there are memes about you all over social media. My friends keep asking if you really hired a psychic to run your company. It's not that simple, Sterling began. Actually, it is, Rebecca interrupted. You let some carnival fortune teller influence major business decisions, and now you're surprised that people think you've lost your mind. Sterling's son Michael, 17 and brutally honest, added, Dad, everyone at school is talking about how you fired some brilliant engineer because a psychic told you to. Do you understand how embarrassing this is? The conversation was interrupted by Marcus Webb, who entered without his usual deference. Richard, we have a problem. The board has called an emergency meeting for this afternoon. They're voting on your removal as CEO. Rebecca looked at her ex-husband with something approaching pity. Richard, you need help, real help, not from Crystal Morrison, but from actual professionals. Back at Mika's house, Danny Morrison had spread the contents of his folder across her kitchen table. The documents painted a damning picture of corporate decision-making guided by mysticism rather than business sense. This email, Danny pointed to a printed message, shows my mother advising Sterling to delay the Samsung partnership because she'd had a dream about technological dragons from the East. And here's a recording of her telling him that your energy signature was incompatible with the company's cosmic trajectory. James examined the documents with growing amazement. This is incredible. It's like a case study in corporate insanity. The worst part, Danny continued, is that I knew it was wrong. I saw how brilliant you were, Mrs. Bradley. I read your patents, tried to understand your work. I knew I couldn't replace you, but I was too weak to stand up to my mother or to Sterling. Mika felt a complex mix of emotions as she looked at the young man who had inadvertently triggered the destruction of her career. Danny, why are you doing this now? Because it's the right thing to do. And because I finally found the courage my mother always claimed the universe would provide. His smile was rueful. Turns out the universe's timing is different than hers. The afternoon brought Mika's medical appointment, which confirmed her worst fears. The stress of the legal battle and media attention had triggered irregular heartbeats that could become dangerous if left untreated. Mrs. Bradley, her cardiologist explained, you need to reduce stress immediately. I'm prescribing medication, but more importantly, you need to consider whether this fight is worth risking your health. James drove her home in silence. both of them processing the doctor's words. Finally, as they pulled into her driveway, he spoke. "Mom, I know this case means everything to you. I know it's about more than money or even justice, but I can't lose you. Dad's gone, and you're all I have left of that generation. Please consider settling this before it kills you." That evening, Mika sat in her home office, surrounded by the documents that had consumed her life for the past week. Danny Morrison's evidence could strengthen her case significantly, but at what personal cost? Her health was deteriorating. Her family was under siege, and the global attention showed no signs of diminishing. Her phone buzzed with a text from Sarah Collins. Zenith's board just removed Sterling as CEO. Marcus Webb called. They want to negotiate a comprehensive settlement. We're winning. But as Mika looked at the prescription bottles on her desk and thought about her son's pleading eyes, she wondered if winning was worth dying for. The patent war had given her everything she'd fought for: vindication, accountability, and global recognition of corporate wrongdoing. The question now was whether she was strong enough to see it through to the end, or whether the cost of victory had become too high to bear. Outside her window, the Silicon Valley night glittered with the lights of countless tech companies, each one now aware that actions had consequences, and that even the most powerful executives could be brought down by the knowledge and determination of a single engineer. But that engineer was running out of strength, and everyone knew it. The surveillance began on a Tuesday morning, though Mika wouldn't discover it for another 3 days. A nondescript gray sedan had taken up residence across from her house, its occupants rotating in 12-hour shifts, documenting her every movement with telephoto lenses and directional microphone. Richard Sterling, stripped of his CEO title but still fighting for his corporate life, had made the decision that would ultimately destroy him completely. Crystal Morrison had planted the seed during their emergency strategy session the night after Sterling's removal. "Richard, this woman has declared war on us using dark energy. We need to fight back with every weapon at our disposal. The universe demands aggressive action." Sterling, desperate and increasingly unmoored from rational thought, had authorized what Marcus Webb would later describe as a criminal conspiracy disguised as corporate defense. Private investigators, cyber warfare specialists, and reputation management firms were retained with one goal: destroy Mika Bradley's credibility by any means necessary. The first attack came through her computer system. Mika was reviewing Danny Morrison's documents when her laptop screen flickered and went black. When it restarted, she found that years of personal files had been corrupted, including family photos and correspondence with her late husband. The violation felt intensely personal, as if Sterling's people had invaded her memories. "Mom, you need to see this," James called from her living room, his voice tight with anger. He was staring at his phone, his face pale. "Someone's posted your address, your phone number, and your daily routine on social media. They're calling it public information for transparency." Mika felt a chill of fear that had nothing to do with her heart condition. Who would do that? The account was created yesterday. It claims to be concerned citizens seeking truth about corporate manipulation. But look at the timing of the posts. They correspond exactly with your movements over the past 3 days. Sarah Collins arrived within an hour, her legal mind immediately recognizing the escalation from corporate warfare to personal harassment. "This is stalking, Mika, and if we can prove Sterling authorized it, it's conspiracy to commit harassment. We need to document everything and contact the police." But the sabotage campaign was just beginning. That afternoon, Elena Vasquez called with disturbing news. "Mika, they're trying to destroy my credibility. Someone leaked altered versions of my employment records to Tech Reporter, claiming I was fired for incompetence rather than placed on administrative leave. They've taken real documents and changed key details to make it look like I fabricated evidence against Sterling." Elena's voice carried exhaustion and fear. "I've been getting threatening phone calls, anonymous voices telling me to retract my statements or face consequences. My daughter's school called, someone contacted them, claiming I was under investigation for corporate espionage." The systematic nature of the attacks became clear when David Chen called with his own story of harassment. "Mika, Someone filed a complaint with the State Bar Association claiming I've been providing fraudulent legal advice about patent law. They've submitted fake documents suggesting I misrepresented your essential patent holder status. Can they prove the documents are fake? Eventually, yes, but the process will take months, and in the meantime, my reputation is under attack. They're playing a longer game. If they can discredit me, your entire legal strategy becomes questionable. Marcus Webb was having the worst week of his legal career. As Zenith's general counsel, he'd been trying to manage the legal fallout from Sterling's removal while maintaining some semblance of corporate governance. But Sterling's sabotage campaign was creating new liabilities faster than Marcus could address them. His discovery of the illegal activities came through a routine review of corporate expenditure. Buried in consultant fees and legal costs, he found payments to firms he'd never authorized, private investigation companies, cybersecurity specialists, and reputation management consultants, all hired without proper board approval. Jesus Christ, Marcus muttered, reviewing invoices that detailed surveillance operations, cyber attacks, and character assassination campaigns. Sterling hadn't just authorized corporate espionage, he'd created a paper trail that could send him to prison. Marcus called an emergency meeting with the interim CEO, presenting evidence that Zenith was actively engaging in criminal activities against Mika Bradley. We need to stop this immediately, he explained. If this gets out, and it will get out, the company won't survive the scandal. We're talking about federal charges for conspiracy, harassment, and computer crimes. The interim CEO's face went ashen as she reviewed the documents. How do we contain this? We don't, Marcus said grimly. We cooperate fully with law enforcement, and hope that demonstrating good faith helps minimize the damage, and we fire everyone involved in this operation, starting with Sterling's remaining allies. The breakthrough came when Elena Vasquez made a discovery that would change everything. Working late in her home office, she was reviewing security footage from her apartment building when she noticed the same gray sedan that had been following Mika parked outside her building for 3 consecutive nights. I started thinking about patterns, she would later tell Jennifer Stone. If they're watching Mika and they're harassing me, maybe they're conducting broader surveillance. So I reached out to other people who've supported Mika's case. What Elena discovered was a coordinated campaign targeting every key figure in Mika's legal team. David Chen was being followed. Sarah Collins' office phones had been compromised. Even Jennifer Stone had been under surveillance, her investigative activities monitored, and her sources identified. But Elena had also made another discovery. She'd been secretly recording meetings at Zenith for months, including conversations where Sterling and Crystal Morrison explicitly discussed the sabotage campaign. I have recordings of them planning this, Elena told Sarah Collins during an emergency meeting. Sterling authorized surveillance, cyber attacks, and character assassination. Crystal Morrison specifically suggested neutralizing the negative energy sources through aggressive defensive measures. The recordings were devastating. In one conversation, Sterling could be heard saying, "I don't care what it costs or what laws we have to bend. This woman has destroyed my reputation and my company. I want her discredited and broken." Crystal Morrison's voice was equally damning. "The universe has shown me that sometimes you must embrace darkness to restore light. This woman's energy is toxic, and toxic energy must be contained by any means necessary." Sarah Collins reviewed the recordings with barely contained excitement. "This isn't just harassment, this is conspiracy to commit multiple felonies. Sterling has handed us enough evidence to put him in prison." The final piece of the puzzle came when a whistleblower from one of the hired private investigation firms contacted Jennifer Stone. The investigator, uncomfortable with the increasingly illegal nature of their assignments, provided detailed logs of surveillance activities, cyber attacks, and planned character assassination campaign. They wanted us to plant evidence of financial impropriety in Bradley's personal accounts, the investigator revealed. When we refused, they threatened to find someone who would. This isn't corporate research, it's organized crime. That evening, as Mika sat in her home office reviewing the evidence of Sterling's criminal campaign against her, She felt a mixture of vindication and exhaustion. The man who had fired her for cosmic reasons had now revealed himself to be not just incompetent, but actively criminal. Her phone rang. Sarah Collins. Mika, we need to talk. The evidence Elena found combined with the whistleblower information gives us grounds for criminal charges against Sterling, but more importantly, it gives us leverage to end this war on our terms. What do you mean? I mean, Richard Sterling just handed us complete victory. He's going to prison, Zenith is going to pay whatever we ask, and your story is going to reshape corporate accountability forever. The question is whether you're strong enough to see it through. Mika looked at her prescription bottles, thought about her son's worried face, and considered the global attention that continued to grow around her case. Sterling's sabotage campaign had backfired spectacularly, providing her with more ammunition than she'd ever imagined possible. Schedule the meeting, she said. It's time to end this. The war was nearly over, and Mika Bradley was about to claim total victory. Marcus Webb sat in his BMW in the parking garage beneath Sarah Collins' law office, his hands trembling as he gripped a briefcase containing 20 years of corporate secret. The general counsel who had once been Zenith Technologies' most loyal defender was about to become its most damaging witness. The decision had torn him apart for weeks, but Sterling's criminal sabotage campaign had finally pushed him past his breaking point. The meeting had been arranged through intermediaries. Marcus couldn't be seen walking into Mika Bradley's attorney's office, not while he was still technically employed by Zenith, but the evidence he carried would likely end his career and possibly send his former colleagues to prison. It was a price he'd finally decided he was willing to pay. Sarah Collins met him at the elevator, her expression carefully neutral. She'd handled enough high-stakes whistleblower cases to recognize the signs of a man whose conscience had finally overcome his corporate loyalty. Mr. Webb, thank you for coming. I know this can't be easy for you. Marcus followed her into a conference room where Mika Bradley sat waiting, her presence both dignified and commanding despite the strain visible in her face. For a moment, the two stared at each other, the corporate lawyer who had enabled her destruction, and the engineer whose integrity had ultimately destroyed the company. Ms. Bradley, Marcus said quietly, I owe you an apology, more than an apology, I owe you the truth. Mika studied his face, seeing genuine remorse where she'd once encountered corporate obstruction. Mr. Webb, why are you here? Marcus opened his briefcase and began spreading documents across the conference table, emails, recorded conversations, financial records and internal memos that painted a devastating picture of corporate corruption stretching back 3 years. Because Richard Sterling has lost his mind, and I can't be complicit in criminal activity anymore. Marcus's voice carried exhaustion and resignation. What he's done to you, what he's authorized against your legal team, it's not just wrong, it's insane, and I have documented proof of all of it. He pointed to a printed email chain. This shows Sterling authorizing the surveillance operation against you based on Crystal Morrison's advice that you were channeling negative cosmic energy. He specifically wrote, I don't care about legal nicety. This woman is trying to destroy me with dark forces, and I want her neutralized. Sarah Collins leaned forward, her legal mind immediately recognizing the implications. Neutralized? He used that exact word, multiple times. And here's a recorded conversation, where Crystal Morrison tells him that the universe demands aggressive action against energy parasites. Marcus pulled out a digital recorder. Sterling responds by saying, do whatever it takes, I have unlimited resources, and unlimited authorization. Mika listened to her former CEO's voice discussing her destruction with clinical detachment, but inside, she felt a mixture of vindication and disgust. The man who had fired her for cosmic guidance was now revealed as someone willing to break any law to protect his delusion. There's more, Marcus continued, his voice growing stronger as he unburdened himself of months of suppressed guilt. Sterling has been making major business decisions, based on Crystal Morrison's psychic advice for over 2 years. Not just personnel decisions, major contracts, strategic partnerships, research and development priorities. He pulled out a thick folder labeled Morrison Consultancy, Strategic Guidance. Samsung partnership terminated because Crystal dreamed about technological dragon. European expansion delayed because Mercury was in retrograde. The acquisition of quantum computing startup Nexus Technologies, cancelled because Crystal said their founders had incompatible auras. Sarah Collins was taking notes, furious. How much money are we talking about in lost opportunities? Conservative estimate, $700 million in lost revenue over 2 years. The Samsung deal alone was worth $200 million annually. Mika felt a strange sense of relief washing over her. Termination hadn't been an isolated incident of poor judgment. It was part of a pattern of corporate insanity that had been destroying Zenith from within for years. Why didn't you speak up earlier? She asked. Marcus was quiet for a long moment. Because I'm a coward. Because I thought I could contain the damage from within. Because I convinced myself that as long as the company remained profitable, Sterling's eccentricities were manageable. He looked directly at her. I was wrong, and I'm sorry. The conversation was interrupted by Marcus's phone buzzing with an urgent call from Zenith's interim CEO. Marcus, where are you? The FBI just served search warrants on Sterling's office and home. They're seizing all computers and documents related to the Bradley matter. We need you here immediately. Marcus looked at Sarah and Mika, then made a decision that would define the rest of his career. I'm exactly where I need to be. The company needs to cooperate fully with law enforcement, and you need to know that I'm providing evidence to Ms. Bradley's legal team. The silence on the other end was deafening. Marcus, are you saying you're testifying against the company? I'm saying I'm testifying for the truth. There's a difference. After he hung up, Marcus continued his document review with renewed urgency. The evidence he provided was comprehensive and damning. 3 years of decisions that violated basic corporate governance, employment law, and now federal criminal statutes. The surveillance operation was just the beginning, he explained. Sterling also authorized attempts to hack into your personal financial accounts, looking for anything that could be used to discredit you. When that failed, he approved a plan to plant evidence of financial impropriety. You have proof of that. Marcus pulled out a contract with a cybersecurity firm, $500,000 to conduct comprehensive background verification and remedial action if necessary. The remedial action clause specifically authorizes the creation of supporting documentation if natural evidence proves insufficient. Sarah Collins whistled softly. They were going to frame you for financial crimes. It gets worse, Marcus continued. Crystal Morrison suggested that if legal approaches failed, they should consider metaphysical intervention. She actually proposed hiring someone to break into your home to place negative energy crystals that would disrupt your cosmic balance and cause you to make self-destructive decisions. The absurdity of it would have been comical if the implications weren't so serious. Mika found herself almost admiring the thoroughness of Sterling's delusion. He'd managed to combine corporate crime with New Age mysticism in ways that defied rational comprehension. There's one more thing, Marcus said, pulling out a final document. Sterling has been secretly funneling company money to Crystal Morrison's other business ventures. She operates a network of spiritual consulting companies, and Zenith has paid them over $2 million in the past year for forays that can't be documented or verified. That's embezzlement, Sarah said immediately. Corporate funds used for personal purposes without board approval. Marcus nodded grimly. The board doesn't know about any of this. Sterling hid the payments in various consulting budgets, and I helped him do it because I thought I was protecting the company from bad publicity. As the evidence review continued, Mika began to understand the true scope of what she'd uncovered. Her wrongful termination had exposed a massive corporate conspiracy involving criminal harassment, cybercrimes, attempted fraud, and embezzlement. Richard Sterling hadn't just made a bad personnel decision, he'd created a criminal enterprise guided by psychic advice. Marcus, she said finally, what made you decide to come forward now? He was quiet for a moment, gathering his thoughts. Because last week Crystal Morrison suggested that the only way to end this crisis was to arrange for you to have a cosmic accident. She said the universe sometimes required direct intervention to restore balance. The room fell silent. Sterling didn't explicitly approve it, but he didn't reject it either. That's when I realized that staying silent wasn't just enabling fraud, it might be enabling violence. Marcus closed his briefcase, having transferred its entire contents to Sarah Collins' file. I've spent 20 years building a career based on protecting corporate interests. But some things are more important than career advancement. Truth, justice, basic human decency. He stood to leave, then turned back to Mika. For what it's worth, Bradley, I always knew you were the best engineer we had. I should have fought for you instead of fighting against you. As Marcus walked toward the elevator, Mika realized that her victory was now complete. She had the evidence to destroy Sterling, the support of his own general counsel, and the backing of global public opinion. The patent war was nearly over, and she had won more decisively than she'd ever imagined possible. Tomorrow, she would decide how to use that victory. Richard Sterling stood in what had once been his corner office, now stripped of personal items and corporate authority, watching federal agents catalog evidence that would likely send him to prison. The FBI had spent 3 days dismantling his professional life, seizing computers, phones, and documents that chronicled 3 years of increasingly desperate decisions, guided by cosmic advice and criminal intent. Crystal Morrison sat in the chair across from his desk, no longer his desk, he reminded himself. Her usual mystical confidence, replaced by the hard pragmatism of someone facing federal charges. The woman who had claimed to channel the universe's business wisdom was now focused entirely on earthly concerns like plea bargains and prison sentences. Richard, we need to declare bankruptcy, she said, her voice stripped of its usual ethereal cadence. If we file for Chapter 11, we can void the patent licensing agreements and eliminate Zenith's liability for the global freeze. It's our only option. Sterling stared at her, finally seeing clearly the carnival fortune teller beneath the corporate consultant facade. Crystal, bankruptcy won't protect us from criminal charges. It won't undo the surveillance, the cyber attacks, or the attempted fraud. It'll just add bankruptcy fraud to our list of felonies. The universe has shown me. Stop, Sterling's voice carried finality. The universe didn't show you anything. You're a fraud who destroyed my company with parlor tricks and new age nonsense, and I was an idiot for listening to you. Before Crystal could respond, Sterling's phone rang with news that would seal their fate. The caller was Jennifer Stone, and her questions indicated that the global tech industry had reached its breaking point. Mr. Sterling, this is Jennifer Stone from Tech Reporter. I'm calling for comment on the coalition of tech companies that's formed to demand immediate resolution of the patent freeze. Apple, Google, Microsoft, and Samsung are jointly threatening to boycott all Zenith Technologies unless the Bradley situation is resolved within 48 hours. Do you have any response? Sterling hung up without answering, but the message was clear. The most powerful companies in the world were now aligned against him, wielding economic weapons that could destroy Zenith entirely within weeks. Meanwhile, in Zenith's boardroom, an emergency meeting was unfolding that would determine the company's survival. The interim CEO, Margaret Chen, faced a room full of directors whose patience had been exhausted by weeks of crisis management. Ladies and gentlemen, Margaret began, we have reached a decision point that will define this company's future. The patent freeze has cost the global industry over $2 billion. The criminal charges against our former leadership threaten our corporate reputation permanently. And now we're facing a coordinated boycott from our largest clients. Board member Robert Kim, a veteran of Silicon Valley's corporate wars, spoke first. How do we end this? What does Bradley want? According to her attorney, Bradley wants comprehensive corporate policy reforms, significant financial compensation, and public acknowledgement of the wrongdoing against her. But more importantly, she wants accountability, criminal prosecution for Sterling and Morrison. And if we don't settle, Margaret consulted her notes grimly. The patent freeze continues indefinitely. The criminal investigation expands to include the entire executive team. The client boycott destroys our revenue base, and we face shareholder lawsuits that could exceed our total market capitalization. In a conference room across Silicon Valley, Mika Bradley was preparing for what would likely be the final negotiation of her patent war. Sarah Collins had assembled a legal team that included David Chen, Marcus Webb, and testimony from Elena Vasquez and Danny Morrison. The evidence against Sterling and Zenith was overwhelming, but Mika faced a decision that would define her legacy. "We hold all the cards," Sarah explained, reviewing their negotiation strategy. "Sterling is facing federal prison time. Zenith is bleeding money and credibility. The global tech industry is pressuring them to settle. We can demand anything we want." James Bradley sat beside his mother, his concern evident despite their legal advantage. "Mom, your heart condition is getting worse. The stress of this fight is literally killing you. Maybe it's time to consider what victory actually looks like." Mika studied the medical report her cardiologist had delivered that morning. The irregular heartbeats were becoming more frequent, and the medication was losing effectiveness. Her body was paying the price for her principled stand. "What are you suggesting, James?" "I'm suggesting that destroying Sterling completely might not be as satisfying as proving your point and protecting your health. You've already won. The world knows you were right. You've changed corporate accountability forever. Maybe that's enough." David Chen, ever the legal strategist, presented the maximum scenario. "If we push for complete victory, we could get 50 million in damages, criminal convictions for everyone involved, and precedent-setting corporate reforms. But it means months more litigation and media attention. And if we settle reasonably, 25 million, Sterling's resignation and criminal prosecution, policy reforms at Zenith, and industry-wide changes to prevent similar abuses, plus immediate resolution of the patent freeze, which gets the global tech industry off our back." The high-stakes negotiation began at 2 p.m. in a neutral conference room, with representatives from Zenith, law enforcement, and the coalition of affected tech companies all present. Sterling sat at one end of the table, flanked by criminal defense attorneys and looking like a man who had finally understood the consequences of his cosmic guidance. Margaret Chen opened with a comprehensive settlement offer that acknowledged wrongdoing, provided financial compensation, and committed to extensive corporate reform. But it was conditional on Mika's agreement not to pursue additional criminal charges beyond those already filed by federal prosecutors. "Bradley," Margaret said directly, "Zenith Technologies formally acknowledges that your termination was illegal, discriminatory, and based on inappropriate non-business factor. We accept full responsibility for the global patent crisis and commit to implementing comprehensive reforms to prevent similar incidents." Sterling's lead attorney presented his client's position. "Sterling accepts responsibility for poor judgment in personnel decisions and inappropriate business practices. However, he maintains that his actions were guided by what he believed to be legitimate consulting advice, not criminal intent." Sarah Collins responded with prosecutorial precision. "Ms. Sterling authorized surveillance, cyber attacks, and attempted fraud against my client. His criminal intent is documented in recordings and emails. The consulting advice defense doesn't apply to federal felonies." Crystal Morrison's attorney attempted damage control. Ms. Morrison provided strategic consulting services based on alternative business methodologies. She had no knowledge of illegal activities and bears no responsibility for Mr. Sterling's implementation of her advice. The most dramatic moment came when Sterling himself finally spoke, his voice carrying exhaustion and genuine remorse. "Ms. Bradley, I want to apologize personally, not as a legal strategy, but because I owe you the truth. I fired you because I was scared of your competence, threatened by your expertise, and dependent on validation from someone who told me what I wanted to hear rather than what I needed to know." He paused, gathering courage for what came next. "You were the best engineer at Zenith. You were the backbone of our patent portfolio, and I destroyed your career because a fortune teller convinced me that the universe wanted fresh energy in our engineering department." The room was silent as Sterling continued. "I can't undo what I did to you, but I can accept responsibility for it. I'll plead guilty to the federal charges. I'll cooperate fully with law enforcement, and I'll use whatever influence I have left to ensure that no other executive makes the catastrophic mistakes I made." Crystal Morrison stared at Sterling in shock, realizing that her primary ally had just abandoned her completely. Mika looked across the table at the man who had destroyed her career and nearly destroyed her health, seeing not a powerful CEO, but a broken individual who had finally found his moral compass. "Mr. Sterling," she said quietly. "I accept your apology, and I accept your commitment to change." Then she turned to the room full of lawyers, executives, and law enforcement officials. "I have one final condition for settling this matter. I want my story told in corporate training programs across the industry. Every executive, every manager, every person with hiring authority needs to understand what happens when bias, superstition, and arrogance replace competence and integrity in business decisions." The settlement was finalized within hours, ending the patent war that had brought the global tech industry to its knees. Richard Sterling would plead guilty to federal charges, serve prison time, and become a cautionary tale taught in business schools worldwide. Crystal Morrison would face her own criminal charges and the destruction of her consulting empire. But for Mika Bradley, the victory was bittersweet. She had proven her point and secured her legacy, but at enormous personal cost. As she signed the settlement documents, she wondered if justice was truly worth the price she had paid. The war was over. Now came the harder task of determining what peace would look like. 6 months after the settlement, Mika Bradley stood at the podium of Stanford University's Engineering Auditorium, looking out at an audience of 300 graduate students, professors, and industry professionals. The Bradley Lecture on Corporate Ethics and Engineering Leadership had become the most sought-after speaking engagement in Silicon Valley, and today marked the 10th presentation of her story to the next generation of tech leaders. Her health had stabilized since the stress of litigation, and the heart medication was working, the irregular beats had diminished, and her cardiologist had cleared her for limited travel and public speaking. More importantly, the weight of fighting for justice had been replaced by the satisfaction of creating lasting change. "When I walked into that conference room 18 months ago for what I thought was a routine quarterly review," Mika began, her voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who had faced down corporate power and won, "I never imagined that my termination would reshape international patent law and corporate accountability standards worldwide." In the front row, James Bradley watched his mother with obvious pride. The fear and worry that had consumed him during the legal battle had been replaced by admiration for her resilience and the global impact of her courage. His children, now 9 and 11, regularly told their classmates that their grandmother was famous for beating the bad guys with math and legal stuff. The audience listened intently as Mika outlined the cascading effects of her patent war. The essential patent holder protections had been strengthened internationally, making it nearly impossible for companies to terminate critical technical personnel without proper legal review. Age discrimination lawsuits in the tech industry had increased by 300%, with many citing the Bradley case as precedent. And most significantly, over 200 major corporations had implemented Bradley protocols, mandatory review processes for personnel decisions involving employees over 50. The $25 million settlement was never the point, Mika continued. The point was proving that knowledge has power, that experience has value, and that even the most powerful executives are accountable for their decisions, especially when those decisions are based on cosmic advice rather than business sense. The audience laughed at the reference to Crystal Morrison, whose conviction for conspiracy and fraud had become a cautionary tale about the dangers of mixing mysticism with corporate governance. Morrison was serving 3 years in federal prison and would likely never work in business consulting again. Richard Sterling's fate had been more complex. His 18-month prison sentence for conspiracy, harassment, and embezzlement had been served at a minimum security facility, where he'd spent much of his time teaching business ethics classes to other white-collar offenders. Upon release, he'd become an unlikely advocate for corporate accountability, speaking at conferences about the dangers of executive isolation and decision-making based on ego rather than evidence. "Mr. Sterling contacted me last month," Mika revealed to the audience. "He's established a foundation focused on preventing age discrimination in the tech industry. Part of his sentence included community service requirements, and he's chosen to fulfill them by funding scholarships for engineers over 50 who want to pursue advanced degrees or career transition." It was a redemption story that surprised many who had followed the case. Sterling's public transformation from cosmic guidance-seeking CEO to accountability advocate had been genuine if painful. He'd lost his wealth, his reputation, and his freedom, but found something approaching wisdom in the process. Danny Morrison had perhaps undergone the most dramatic transformation of all the case's participants. After resigning from Zenith and providing evidence against Sterling and his mother, he'd enrolled in engineering school at UC Berkeley. Now in his second year of quantum computing studies, he was one of Mika's most dedicated correspondents, sending regular updates on his progress and seeking advice on technical concepts. "I received an email from Danny yesterday," Mika told the audience, pulling out her phone to read directly from his message. "Ms. Bradley, I finally understand what you meant when you said that quantum coherence requires both precision and patience. I'm starting to see why my mother's shortcuts and intuitive approaches could never replace the methodical work that real engineering demands. Thank you for showing me what intellectual integrity looks like." Elena Vasquez had thrived in the aftermath of the case. Her decision to blow the whistle on Sterling's erratic behavior had made her a sought-after expert on corporate governance and workplace ethics. She'd left engineering to become a consultant, specializing in helping companies identify and prevent toxic leadership patterns. Her documentation methods, honed during years of secretly recording Sterling's mystical decision-making processes, had become standard practice for risk management professionals. Marcus Webb's journey had been more complicated. His decision to provide evidence against Sterling had ended his career at Zenith, but it had also restored his professional integrity. After serving as the key witness in the federal prosecution, he'd opened a boutique law practice specializing in corporate whistleblower cases. His first-hand experience with the costs of enabling corrupt leadership made him uniquely effective at helping other corporate lawyers navigate ethical crises. Sarah Collins had become one of the most prominent employment attorneys in the country, with the Bradley case serving as the cornerstone of a practice that now handled hundreds of age discrimination cases annually. She'd been invited to testify before Congress about strengthening workplace protection laws, and had co-authored a book on strategic litigation that was required reading in law schools nationwide. David Chen had achieved something approaching celebrity status in patent law circles. His analysis of essential patent holder requirements had been cited in over 50 subsequent cases, and he'd been appointed to a United Nations committee reviewing international intellectual property protection. The legal precedent established by Mika's case had fundamentally changed how companies handled the termination of employees with critical technical knowledge. Jennifer Stone had won a Pulitzer Prize for her investigative series on corporate mysticism in Silicon Valley decision-making. Her follow-up articles had exposed similar patterns at other tech companies, leading to additional investigations and reforms throughout the industry. She'd parlayed the recognition into a position as senior business correspondent for The New York Times, where she continued to investigate corporate accountability issues. "The most important lesson from my experience," Mika concluded her Stanford lecture, "is that individual actions can have profound systemic consequences. One illegal termination led to global patent law reform. One woman's refusal to accept injustice quietly created protections for millions of older workers. One engineer's meticulous documentation brought down a criminal conspiracy, guided by tarot cards and astrological charts." She paused, looking out at the young faces in the audience, future engineers, entrepreneurs, and executives who would shape the next generation of technological innovation. "You will all face moments in your careers when you must choose between what's expedient and what's right, between what's profitable and what's ethical, between what's popular and what's true. When those moments come, remember that your technical knowledge is not just a professional asset. It's a form of power that comes with responsibility." After the lecture, Mika drove home through the Silicon Valley afternoon, past the gleaming headquarters of companies that now bore plaques commemorating her case's impact on corporate ethics. The Zenith building, under new leadership and rebuilt corporate culture, displayed a sign dedicating their engineering wing to the advancement of technical excellence and ethical leadership in honor of Mika Bradley's contributions to our industry. At home, she tended to the jade plant her husband had given her 40 years ago, now thriving in her home office, surrounded by awards, honorary degrees, and letters from engineers around the world who had been inspired by her story. Her patent war had cost her health, stress, and peace of mind, but it had also created a legacy that would protect others for generations to come. The war was over, and justice had prevailed. But more importantly, the battle had changed the rules of corporate power forever, ensuring that experience, integrity, and knowledge would never again be dismissed because some fortune teller claimed the universe demanded fresh energy. Mika Bradley had won more than a legal case. She had won the future. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.